The ceasefire in Aleppo did not last long. Despite a deal worked out between Russia and Turkey, shelling resuming in a matter of hours, with rebel groups accusing Iran of blocking the agreement as the West argues over Russia's role, essentially in the air campaign over Syria's largest city. It's actually Tehran-backed militias that are doing a good portion of the actual fighting on the ground. Those militias include Iranians, but also a wide band of pro-Shia militants, from Lebanese Hezbollah fighters to guns for hire from as far away as Pakistan. Now, here's the confusing bit. It's a similar coalition that's fighting alongside U.S.-backed forces to retake Mosul from ISIS in neighboring Iraq. Will an incoming Trump administration really go through with its threat to try and tear up the Iran nuclear deal? With what consequences for Iraq and for Syria? It's all happening just as Iran comes out of international isolation, striking a deal with its OPEC partners, including arch-rival Saudi Arabia. After the fall of Aleppo, what future for Iran and Syria and in the wider region? Today in the France-24 debate, is Aleppo's fall Iran's win? With us from Istanbul, Borzo Dargahi, Middle East correspondent for BuzzFeed News. Thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
From New York, Ben Taub, contributing writer to The New Yorker. Thank you for being with us here in the France-24 debate.
Thank you.
The France-24 debate, where you've been weighing in on the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Let's start with the latest inside Aleppo, where the Assad government and a pro-Tehran Iraqi militia, by the way, deny a UN report that 82 civilians, including 13 children, were slaughtered exiting East Aleppo, a story we were talking about Tuesday on this channel, a claim echoed by besieged white helmets, those civil defense volunteers who fear the same fate.
The genocide will happen in the coming days if nothing will stop them in the coming hours. In the coming hours, maybe SS forces will advance more on the ground and they capture what the last neighborhood where all those civilians are trapped now. Yeah, of course I'm worried. I'm really scared about what happened. There's no choice. There's no choice. Maybe we'll be slaughtered by knives.
Borzo Dargahi, that volunteer speaking on Tuesday before we heard about those buses showing up to take civilians out of East Aleppo, buses that left empty-handed. What's the latest you're hearing?
Well, I think there's still a question as to whether the negotiations over allowing civilians and even rebels to leave eastern Aleppo are finalized. We're getting claims by Russia and Turkey, joint statements issued saying that, they've finalized the deal. But I'm very skeptical until I hear the Syrian side and the Iranian side confirm that they've agreed to a deal. You're not going to have a guaranteed deal. And as a matter of fact, we talked to people inside eastern Aleppo who said they witnessed actual arguments between the Russian officials attempting to get some of these people onto buses and members of Shia militias, not clear if they were Lebanese or Iraqi or just Iranian advisors, telling them, no way, we have no deal.
Iranian President Hassan Rouhani, according to Syrian media, Borzu, sending a congratulatory message to Bashar al-Assad on his victory in liberated Aleppo, saying it was, quote, an important step towards wiping out terrorism in Syria. Congratulatory messages, but we're still hearing shelling. Is it too soon?
I think it's probably not too soon. I think that, in the eyes of the Iranian regime, the victory is pretty complete, and it's just basically at this point negotiating the terms of the surrender. Some of that terminology there describing the rebels as terrorists, this has been the kind of conflation that the pro-regime side and even some leftist and right-wing supporters and apologists for the Assad regime in the West have used essentially conflating, sort of blurring the line between some of the more extreme elements of the Syrian opposition that are fighting Bashar al-Assad and the civil society activists, the humanitarian workers, the doctors even, as well as some of the more moderate rebels and other political organizations within the Syrian opposition, conflating those people with the more extreme elements and just calling them all terrorists.
Calling them all terrorists, and the sense that it's a brutal outcome that reminds people of what happened in Grozny.
I mean, it is quite brutal. We should caution, however, that it's not over. Syrian rebels and other groups that do not answer to the government of Bashar al-Assad control huge swaths of the country still, including much of the countryside outside the city of Aleppo. They control what's called the Rif, the countryside of Aleppo. They control pretty much all of Idlib province. ISIS controls huge swaths of the country's northeast. And then Syrian Kurdish rebels pursuing their own agenda control a very large portion of the north of Syria as well.
Ben Taub, let me ask you, the fall of Aleppo, top story on French news. What's the coverage been like where you are?
Well, I've seen quite widespread coverage over here, although I heard that one TV network last night led the evening news with a meeting between Donald Trump and Kanye West, which I think is frankly embarrassing. This is the worst humanitarian crisis of the 20th century, and it's the first where we're watching the victims of systematic, widespread war crimes essentially live tweeting their extermination. The UN, is unable to do anything at a political level. There's few avenues to justice. In fact, at the moment, the International Criminal Court, which was founded with the intention of serving as a deterrent for widespread war crimes worldwide, given that perpetrators can be arrested anywhere in the world, in theory, the International Criminal Court is totally useless in this scenario because international criminal law is a relatively new and fragile endeavor, and to a disturbing extent, its application is contingent on geopolitics. So Syria is not party to the ICC because it never ratified the Rome Statute, the founding document. And as a result, the only way for the ICC to investigate crimes in Syria, not just by the Syrian government, which is the most prolific perpetrator, but also by rebel groups and by the Islamic State, would be for the UN Security Council to refer jurisdiction, which Russia blocked as a measure in 2014 with its veto power. And so essentially now what we're seeing is Russia is now actively participating in the perpetration of war crimes in Aleppo, and the only way for the ICC to get jurisdiction would be for Russia to refer itself to the ICC, which is never going to happen. So this is really calling into question the entire credibility of the court, the credibility of the UN, and the values that supposedly underline those institutions.
Right. So
not even ICC, even the Geneva Conventions require parties in war, such as Russia and Syria, to safeguard as much as they can the lives of civilians. And you have this grotesque situation right now where they're essentially holding these civilians hostage in order to get other concessions. I mean, it's beyond just the ICC and the latest sort of innovations in international law. This goes back to the basic rules of war that prevent it from falling into all-out savagery.
Exactly. And in fact, what we're seeing is, in the absence of any jurisdiction, was Syria is existing essentially as a vacuum of morality and also as a vacuum of the application of international law. We're seeing that the Rome Statute, the founding document of the ICC, is essentially being used not as a list of prohibitions for conduct, but as a manual for how most efficiently to carry out the military campaign and to humiliate and destroy not only the opposition, but civilians living within its territory.
But gentlemen, before we talk about justice, let's just talk about saving the lives that are still there in East Aleppo. There have been these calls to have UN monitors come in so that civilians don't get ethnically cleansed. What are the chances of that happening?
Well, in June...
I'll answer.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Well, in June... okay.
Well, I think the chances are rather slim at this point, just because of the rather dangerous situation. If viewers recall the UN convoy in recent months that was delivering aid to cities of northern Syria was egregiously bombed by Russian forces, who later denied that they did this. So I don't think that any UN forces are going to be stepping into such a very dangerous situation for them. I don't think UN rules would allow that.
Ben Taub?
Yeah, I completely agree. I would add that in June, when a neighborhood called Madaya was being starved, the UN said that if the Syrian government continued to refuse the UN deliveries of food and medicine to areas under siege where people were being starved to death, which is literally the crime of extermination in the Rome Statute, then they would start doing airdrops to these civilian areas of food and medicine, which never happened. They never followed through on that. Furthermore, the reason that there are people who are starving and suffering under siege with no access to medical care is because the UN will only go into areas to make aid deliveries if the Syrian government gives its permission to do so, which of course is not happening almost all of the time. So, which, as I said, is the crime of extermination. So at a certain point you have to ask the question, at what point is the abstention of enforcing these international laws creating an environment of impunity first, but also of complicity where the UN is almost, by its inaction, participating in this crime of extermination?
All right, lots of reactions coming in on the hashtag F24 debate. Patrick saying the delay of evacuations from Aleppo prompted by Iran. We've seen those claims, by the way, that it was, as Borzo Daragahi was mentioning at the outset, Iranian-backed militias that were preventing people from getting on those buses. It shows how people have always been pawns in the sick and petty games of the powerful. We can welcome to our on set here, always a pleasure to speak to attorney and commentator Ardavan Amir Aslani. Ardavan, we're going to listen to one reaction out of Tehran, one of jubilation to the events taking place in Aleppo.
Triumphs of the brave sons of the region have forced the Western mercenary terrorists to retreat continuously in such a way that they have been swept from Aleppo, the great Syrian city, and God willing, Mosul will be liberated soon.
So a mood of triumph echoed by what we've seen in the press in Iran this Wednesday. And at the same time, what's also interesting, what we heard from Ali Larijani, is equating the Battle of Aleppo with the Battle of Mosul. Are they the same?
The Iranians have a tendency to look at the Iraqi situation, the Syrian situation, as the same story. May I remind you that when the Western forces, the Iraqi government, took the initiative of trying to recover Mosul, their strategy was basically to create a horseshoe strategy, whereby they left a passage for the Daesh, ISIS rebels to be able to leave Mosul and go elsewhere, probably to Syria. The Iranians prevented this horseshoe strategy from being deployed, and they insisted on surrounding the entire city of Mosul and preventing those enemy combatants, as they called them, from leaving. Why? Because they believe that where they're supposed to leave Mosul, they'll end up in Syria, and the Iranians and their allies would have to fight the same folks again in Syria. This is what they're doing now in Aleppo. It's the same strategy, preventing these people that they consider as terrorists from leaving Aleppo so that they won't have to confront them elsewhere. Iraq and Syria is the same combat for the Iranians. And Aleppo today, in the Iranian mind, as in the Syrian regime's mind, is a huge symbolic target. If the rebels lose Aleppo, and that's apparently what's happening today, they will lose the most important presence that they had in a large Syrian city. And it would inevitably be considered as a huge success for the Syrian regime and for its Iranian allies and backers.
And what does it mean, though, for Iran? Because, it's militias that they back that have done a lot of the fighting on the ground. Does it mean they're stuck in for the long haul in Syria?
They're going to be there for the long haul. When the Syrian government takes control of the entire city of Aleppo, this doesn't mean that the Syrian civil war is going to be over. it will be followed elsewhere in other locations. We already noticed that ISIS recovered control of Palmyra a couple of days ago. So this is not the end of the war. It just implies that the Iranians and their allies will have to keep on fighting, both in Iraq and in Syria, for years to come. And this is how they look at it. When you look at the troops on the ground, aside from the Syrian governmental troops, you have the most important people fighting being exclusively Hezbollah troops, as well as the Hashed, which is basically some kind of a foreign legion that the Iranian government set up, comprised exclusively of Shia fighters from Pakistan, from Afghanistan, and from Iraq. They're there for the long haul.
Borza Dargahi, let me ask you about this. And you heard Ardavan mention something there, which was everyone was surprised to see Palmyra recaptured by ISIS. How do you interpret that?
I mean, I would say two things. One is that the Iranian-backed forces, and even to some extent the Syrian-backed forces, have barely fought ISIS on the ground. You know, I was even talking with a Hezbollah official in Lebanon yesterday, and he was kind of quizzical himself, sort of wondering why they have not yet taken on ISIS at any point in this whole conflict. They have fought almost exclusively Syrian rebels, as well as some al-Qaeda-linked groups, but they have not yet confronted ISIS in any meaningful way whatsoever. The Syrian regime has had a very placid front along ISIS territory for years now at this point. It goes into a couple years, and they barely take them on, barely fight them. The only people who do really ferociously fight the ISIS forces in Syria are those same Syrian rebels who are oftentimes fighting for their own towns to get them back.
So how do you, so on that point, how do you, go ahead.
I mean, and second of all, yeah, I agree. This is going to take a long time. This is going to be a long war. And, you know, Iran is digging in for the long haul. Iran is creating sort of institutions, basically, in Iraq, in Syria, and strengthening those institutions in Lebanon to be able to project its own force as well as the force of friendly allies who may or may not agree with it on every single point, but will never, ever act against Iran's major strategic interests in the coming decades.
And it is confusing because Iran is tacitly the ally of the United States when you fight in Mosul and the enemy when you fight in Aleppo.
They have the same enemy, but they have very, very different goals. You know, the Iranian goal is one thing, and it's the same thing with the Kurds as well. The Syrian Kurds, and to a lesser extent the Iraqi Kurds. All these forces are, and we've talked about this before, François, but you know, all these forces are fighting ISIS. All these forces are against ISIS, but they're doing so for very, very different reasons. And in many cases, they're trying to instrumentalize ISIS and instrumentalize the chaos in these countries for their own ends, whether it's building a sort of a vast empire from the Zagros Mountains to the Mediterranean Sea, or to build a Kurdish state. And so, you know, on the day after ISIS is defeated, on the day after there's any semblance of stability in these areas, it might just be the first day of the next war that's coming to the region.
We'll pick up on that point. When we come back, we're going to take a quick break. You're watching the France 24 debate.